In some ways, this is going to be the shortest talk, and in other ways, it's going to be the one that's going to require the most from you guys, and not just this morning, but as you go out and chew over things and think about them in the future. And it should also help you to kind of, when you're doing your own reading and studying, help you a little bit with your analysis. And the last bit that I'm going to spend the most time on is going to be one of the better examples I know of in how to think larger picture in addressing some of this stuff. And I'll warn you now, and I should warn Mr. Shirtliff, except he's not here, so shh, it'll be our secret, that she uses some peppery language. Not potty mouth, but peppery. All right? So if you're shocked and you faint, you know, just somebody will pour water in your head and wake you up. All right? So this is not intended, nor will it be exhaustive or complete or correct or coherent or elucidating. We'll just kind of hope for cogent, right? When you are reset my mouth. When you are trying to analyze flaws in the Constitution and try to figure out what's going on, where the weaknesses are, what you can do about them, it has to be dispassionate, right? Analytical, dispassionate. For those of us who are old enough to remember, as Sergeant Friday used to say, just the facts, ma'am, right? You also need a thorough understanding of the Constitution and how the pieces interact with each other, because if you make a change over here, it's going to change something over here too, right? You don't want to try to correct a little error here only to have this piece that's working pretty well suddenly get flipped, right? So you got to think about stuff. And you have to also look at wider cultural issues. One of the things I've said over and again this week, and other people have said it as well, is that when the self-governance of the people and the moral culture degrades, the watchdogs sleep, right? So there are wider cultural issues, and you have to think critically, not only where we are, where we were, where we want to be, how to get there, but also how to address those wider cultural issues, because nothing happens in a vacuum. The defects that are in the federal Constitution permit the federal governmental branch, right? Because we have branches not only in the federal government, but the federal government is a branch, and then there are the state branch, the county branch, the local branch, right? Defects in the federal Constitution permit the federal branch to abuse the states and the people by taking power and exercising power that is not rightfully assigned to that branch. But ignoring the Constitution also permits abuse of the states. And the proper term there is usurpation of powers not granted. And as Hamilton said, as long as the people, if and only if, right? IFF. In science, if and only if the people know and understand the constitutional limits on federal government and why those limits are there and why they're important. Usurpation of power not granted by Hamilton would therefore be null, void, and of no effect. So if the federal government tries to usurp powers that do not belong to it, the proper response of the states is, not in our borders, you don't. And the proper response of the people is to point fingers and laugh. You think you're going to get away with that? I don't think so. By the way, Representative, you're out. Right? By the way, Senator, we're going to recall you. By the way, Judge, you're being removed. Right? Amending is a proper recourse for defects in the Constitution, but not for usurpation of powers not granted, right? If they steal power that is not theirs to take, you're gonna trick them somehow into passing an amendment to further limit their powers, and they're gonna pay attention to this one? How does that work? You know, it's like, I tell you not to eat the cookies and you eat the cookies. So instead of punishing you for eating the cookies and finding a better hiding place, I say, well, okay, now you don't eat the cake either. And I leave the cake on the counter with a knife and plates and forks, and I walk away. How does this work, right? It's just like, it's, as somebody I worked with years ago said, it's stupid on the face of it. And a lot of the proposed amendments to the Constitution are putting the cake next to the cookies and saying, okay, well, you ate the cookies, but don't eat the cake, right? It's just dumb, right? Nullification is the first recourse by the states and the people, or should be the first recourse, for any usurpation of power by the federal branch of government. After a long train of abuses, if nullification for some reason does not work, then revolution is the proper recourse, said Madison. But if sovereign power resides in the people in this country, nullification is the proper recourse, not revolution. You could think of it as a quiet revolution, right? Spanking the wayward, obnoxious, spoiled child who thinks that by throwing a temper tantrum, they're going to get away with it this time. So some of the fixes that have been proposed by these amendments are worse than the disease. Yes, literally worse than the disease, because at this point we still have the opportunity and the possibility of reclaiming the republic, but with some of the fixes, that becomes ever more remote. The Article 5 Convention, which is actually in the Constitution, that's a disaster waiting to happen. And Mr. Shurtleff would happily talk your ear off on that for a couple of weeks, not long. Right? The so-called balanced budget amendment, oh, that sounds great. Yes, we need a balanced budget amendment, except that if you read the details, it actually makes constitutional spending that is not currently constitutional. And it also allows Congress to increase that budget by balancing it by just printing more money. It's just like, if it sounds good and enemies of the Constitution and the country have proposed it, the title is a trick. Right? Yeah. Just assume that. Parental rights amendment. Oh, that sounds good. Make sure that the government can't take your kids, can't interfere, except that it then gives the federal government authority over families. Right? The cure is worse than the disease. Instead of saying to the state governments, get out of our family lives, you're now telling to the feds, please come meddle. This would not end well. Repeal of the Electoral College, again, it's bad. Just stupid on the face of it, bad, means that New York and California would run the country and everybody else can go jump off a cliff. Right? And Mark Levin's, his liberty amendments, if you go through the list of that, again, they sound good, and then you look and think about it, and it's like, this doesn't work, this won't work, this will make things worse, this make things constitutional that are currently unconstitutional, not a good idea. So we'll look at a couple of them in a little bit more detail. Term limits, there is no length of limit on the length of service for representatives or senators. There wasn't for president until the 22nd Amendment was passed. Why did they pass the 22nd Amendment? Yes, sir. FDR, right? Gave us the Great Society and the Civilian Conservation Corps and Social Security and all the rest of this, and was so well loved by the people that he got elected president 4 times in a row, and he was barely cold in his grave before they said, let's not do this again. And make sure that we can't. That would have been a lovely time to also put limits in on representatives and senators, but since it was representatives and senators who were spearheading the amendment, they didn't want that. We already had career politicians at that point in time. There's also no limit on the length of service by federal officers and federal officials, so ambassadors, heads of agencies, Fauci, right? Departments, And then people just, they hop from one agency to the other. They go from the FBI to the CIA to the Department of Justice to the Department of State to this, right? And they spend their entire career ordering other people's lives around, getting their jollies that way. And there's no limitation on the length of service. So there's probably places where that doesn't matter. Yes, sir. You need to speak up though, because I'll need to hear you.
How long is the governor supposed to stay in office?
That's state rules, not federal. So, different, excellent question, but a different one. All right, and could have 50 different sets of rules. All right, according to the state constitutions. So in some areas, staying in one job for a 50-year career probably doesn't matter. If you're, the administrative assistant to the third undersecretary of dog catching, it probably doesn't matter if that's your one job from the time you get out of secretarial school until you retire, right? Yeah. Right? Because at that point, you know everybody, you know what needs to be routed to something that's important, you know who needs to be placated, you know where the paper's kept, you know where the whiteout is kept, you know where where all the details are, right? The worst thing that can happen in a busy company's department is for the secretary suddenly to get sick. Right? Everything comes to a screeching halt because nobody can find anything and nobody knows how to change an appointment on the schedule, right? So there's some places where length of service wouldn't matter. But head of the CDC, head of the FBI, head of, some senior flunky at the Department of State, why are those not limited? I don't know, right? Think about it. Think about the repercussions. Where is the line between, a lower level person whose job is essential but not, what's the word that I'm looking for? Dangerous, right? Versus somebody at a much higher level who has the ability to cause a lot of harm if they're a plant, right? Or if they're compromised, right? And then we should think why this matters to us. Right? I'm gonna let you think about it. Removal from office. Elections only work to remove a bozo from office if those elections are fair, free, and untainted. But the states have increasingly made it difficult, and the parties working with the states, to recall, have a recall election or just a primary out and then elect somebody who is not an incumbent. Originally, it was made a little difficult to remove people to protect them against being removed from office for a correct but unpopular stance, such as somebody in the southern states being against slavery. You want to protect that person from being removed from office just because of this one stance. But it has transmogrified, and now it protects the vested interests of monolithic government, the deep state, the cabal, the shadow government, whatever you want to call it. And the states and the parties and the counties and towns and cities are complicit in the overall problems. They are actually and actively complicit. In my home state of Massachusetts, the Democrat Party looks very specifically for weak and weak-willed and pathetic candidates for in-state offices and campaigns hard for them to get them into office with more money and more perks and more glory than they ever would have gotten on their own, and then says, we own you. We put you in office. We can make sure that you are arrested for bribery. Here's your bribe. By the way, we have it on film. Right? You do what we tell you. And we don't give a hoot, shall we say, at whether or not your supposed constituents like what we tell you to do or not, because you belong to us. Right? So the states, the parties, the towns, the counties, they're complicit in this, which is why the first place we all need to act is in our local communities and work up to the states and then take over the feds, right? If the problem is huge, you don't start at the top. Undercut the foundation. foundations, and then the edifice crumbles, right? Judges are also appointed for life, except in states where they are elected, in good behavior, but good behavior was not defined. It was also, again, to protect them, to ensure fair decisions so that they aren't fired for making a decision against the governor's opinion or something, right? But the method to remove them for trespass of that good behavior is also not well defined. So we don't have a proper definition of good behavior. Mine would be any one decision that is not in conformance and pursuant to the Constitution constitutes bad behavior. That would, for one metric, right? But there's also no codification of how to get rid of somebody who has then trespassed on good behavior. And again, when the watchdogs sleep, the crooks creep in. Right? Article 5, convention. That would be a disaster. So if the methods for amending are this Article 5 convention or Congress passing amendments by supermajority and then sending those amendments out to the states for ratification, what other options might there be? Should there be a method for direct proposal by the states or direct proposal by the citizens? What could there be? And I'm not gonna, I'm not going to dictate what I would think, but something to think about. If we need a second method, and yes, we need a second method, because, for example, Congress is never going to act in a way that will limit its own usurped power, right? What method might work, and what would be the repercussions of that method, right? The Fifth Amendment, nor shall private property be taken, sorry, I got an error in here, for public use without just compensation. They never defined public use. We've got this horrible Kelo decision in New London, Connecticut. And I would give to you that public use is not the right determinant. I don't like eminent domain in the first place, right? But what about overwhelming public need, which would then, again, have to be defined? Public use, what they did in Kelo was a travesty. Somebody wanted to put in an industrial park. They threw out all the homeowners who were paying their property taxes. And this was supposedly a good idea because the industrial park was going to pay more tax to the town. That's not public use. That's not public need. That's not public good. That's a total usurpation of power, and anybody involved in that should be run out of town on a rail after having been tarred and feathered and probably horsewhipped. Right? And what they ended up with, while still a bad thing for all of the homeowners involved, was just exactly what they deserved. An empty field generating zero public dollars. Right? Because the industrial park fizzled. So now they've got nothing. Right? But for example, when I was living in Worcester, the city took by eminent domain with compensation a house at a very dangerous corner in order to widen the road for better sight lines. I would say that they actually did have justification for doing that because there were several deaths a year at that intersection. And they didn't destroy the house, they helped the person find another piece of property and they moved the house. But the city paid for all of it, right? And then that intersection was able to be widened and the sight lines increased, and after that it was much, much safer. So again, where's the balance between we just want to do it because we think we're going to get more money from it versus we should find a way so that people don't get killed here, right? There's a balance there, and that balance needs to be analyzed and defined in a way that there are guidelines for making a fair decision that balances the public need for safety or whatever against the the ownership claims of the person whose property is being attacked, right? And just compensation is also not defined. And there needs to be some sort of guidelines put in place, you know, for determining what just compensation is. Is it just the monetary value? Well, you know, the monetary value maybe of a house next to a busy intersection where there's a lot of car crashes, maybe that's not very high, except that what would it cost to buy equivalent property elsewhere? Right? What about the sentimental value? This is the house that my great-granddad built, and my family's lived here since 1820. Right? You can't replace that. So how do you define just compensation? Because, you know, a house that was built in 1820, well, maybe it was built next to a road that was a post road at the time, and now it's grown into this big, extremely important multi-lane road. Again, where's the balance, and how do you take into account the need, the claims of sentimental and family history, as well as just, you know, it's not worth much because nobody's going to buy this place next to this busy road, right? And we need to have a better understanding of when public need does override personal property claims. And it's much more on the side of personal property than on public, quote-unquote, need. 14th Amendment, this is the one that's used to do the anchor baby claim. The purpose was to ensure that newly freed slaves were given their proper status as citizens. And the key word is jurisdiction, right? When you're subject to the jurisdiction. The U.S. Supreme Court decisions many, many times have stated that birthplace does not confer citizenship because, again, under Vattel, the child is the citizen or subject of the country to which the parent owes allegiance and whose jurisdiction it is subject to. Right? If you're the ambassador from France and you're stationed in Washington, and while you're there your wife has a baby, the baby's French. Because the ambassador is subject to the jurisdiction of France, even though they are here and living in the United States. Right? It's jurisdiction of the parents. The anchor baby nonsense was actually not even a Supreme Court decision. It was a footnote by Justice Brennan in 1982. I was already out of college by then. That's how recent this is, 1982. And it was on a related topic, but it wasn't even an exact decision. It was a footnote. And it overthrew 200 years of prior Supreme Court decisions. So much for stare decisis. Right? How'd they get away with it? Why'd they want it? Who's complicit? Cui bono, who benefits, right? And why also, and I'll let you investigate this one for yourselves, why do the laws in 1923 offering citizenship to Indian tribes not apply in this instance? You can look it all up in the Cornell Law Library, right? But there was a blanket offer of U.S. citizenship to American Indian tribal members, a number of specific laws, and then a blanket offer in 1923. And those do not apply to the anchor baby question, right? The 19th Amendment, this is the one that we're going to spend time on. This is women's suffrage. Was it a good idea? Was it a bad idea? Was it neutral? And I'm going to read you a chunk of an essay from Anne Barnhart. This is where we get into the peppery language. And I'm going to point out that she does a fabulous job of looking at larger societal, cultural, moral issues, but I think she missed the general attack on the Constitution after the Civil War, the effects of the Federal Reserve System, the degradation of public education, the loss of the state's ambassadors to the federal government with the passage of the 17th Amendment, the effect of the income tax in the 16th Amendment, depression economics, Dust Bowl migrations, removal of the gold standard in 1972 by Nixon, and more. Now, on to her essay here. What? Hey, what'd you do? I must have hit something somehow. All right, this whole essay was from 2011. It's about women's suffrage, and she starts out by saying this was a call with one of her brokerage clients at the time. And the guy says to her, "So, you think the 19th Amendment should be repealed then? You think giving women the right to vote was a bad thing?" Quoth I in retort, "Oh, hell yes." He wasn't expecting that. Will it ever happen? Nope, but it sure is fun to dream. You know when things really started to go, literally, to hell in this country? When women were given the right to vote, separate and apart from their husbands. What a disaster. This is when the war against marriage and the family began in earnest, and it has taken less than 100 years for both institutions to be almost completely destroyed, and it all started with the damn suffrage. Here's the deal. Up until women's suffrage, a man was head of his marriage and his household, and his vote represented not just himself, but his entire family, including his wife and children. When men voted, they were conscious of the fact that they were voting not just for themselves and their own personal interests, but they were also charged with the responsibility of discerning and making the ultimate decision about what was in the best interests of their entire family. Wow. Isn't that nuts? Men being responsible? As soon... Remember, girls, I'm not saying I agree with any of this. I say it's worth listening to and thinking about. I also don't say I disagree. It's left as an exercise for the student, right? No, because I'm not trying to bias people. I want people to think about these things because I think she makes some good points, and I agree in places and I disagree in others, right? You can agree and disagree in other places. As soon as the 19th Amendment was passed, men were effectively castrated and in many, many cases disenfranchised by their wives. No longer was the man head of the household, no longer was he responsible for his wife. Now the wife was a co-husband at best or flat-out adversary at worst. The notion of a man making the final decision about what was best for his wife and family per his God-given vocation as husband and father was now over. Now all he was good for was bringing home the bacon, but even that wouldn't last. Women are made with a healthy, innate desire to be provided for and protected. I know this because I am a woman, despite the pair of enormous brass balls I have to carry around. Those are merely an anomaly. Please ignore them, and no, you may not touch them. I just polished them last night. Back to the point. Women want someone or something to take care of them. For this reason, women tend to lean socialist and are generally in favor of the expansion of government when government promises to provide for them. If you have read my blog for any length of time, you could probably write this next paragraph for yourself. Satan has used this healthy feminine dynamic perverted by suffrage to systematically replace men with government as the providers in society. A woman no longer has any need of a man. Marriage no longer serves any practical purpose. A woman can whore around and have as many fatherless children as she pleases, and pimp daddy government will always be there to provide. Men have learned well from this too. Men can also slut it up to their heart's content, knowing that the government will take care of their women and raise their children for them. Fathering children no longer binds a man to a woman in any way. Men didn't vote to socially castrate themselves and never would have. No, in order for this system to have come about, women's suffrage was an absolute necessity. Women themselves voted the system into place, which objectifies and devalues both them and their children. Next, the issue of disenfranchisement. I believe that the 19th Amendment actually disenfranchised more people than it enfranchised. Many married couples found themselves voting against one another. The man would vote for the more conservative platform, the woman would vote for the more socialist platform. When this happened, the effective result was the nullification of both individuals' votes. What this did was massively reduce the voting influence of the married household and magnify the voting influence of the unmarried. And the unmarried tend to be younger and thus more stupid and thus vote for big government. It was all part of the plan, kids, all part of the plan. I've probably ticked even two of you conservatives off with this post. Here's the question I'd ask you. Why? Why are you ticked off? If you're a woman, the reason you're ticked off is because you put yourself and your desire to assert your will above the well-being of society in general. I don't feel that way. I would give up my vote in a heartbeat if it meant that right-ordered marriage, family, and sexuality was restored to our culture. I would rather that little girls today grow up in a world where they did not have the so-called right, voting is not a right, to vote, but was treated with dignity and respect, was addressed as ma'am, had doors held for her, and wherein men stood up when she entered the room. I would rather she be courted properly and then marry a man who would never, ever leave her and would consider it his sacred duty and honor to protect and provide for her and their children because he loved them. Oh, hell yes. I'll give up my vote in exchange for that any day of the week and twice on Sunday. Why wouldn't you? For you men who don't like my position, you're a slave to political correctness. It's the same thing as the rap music. No one will criticize rap music because it's forbidden by the PC culture to criticize a non-white cultural phenomenon. To do so is bigoted. It's the same with this. PC culture has convinced you that if you criticize anything that has to do with women or the feminine culture, that you must be Taliban. Don't fall for that garbage. That manipulation is why, at this time, 50 million babies had been murdered in this country over the last 38 years. Men knew that abortion was murder, but they punted on it and eventually legalized it because they didn't want to be accused of being misogynistic. Cowards. So there you go. Print it, save it, PDF it. I did. Because I acknowledge the objective reality and massively disordered consequences of female suffrage, and able to see beyond my own immediate self-interest on the matter, and have the stones to say it all publicly, that I am permanently disqualified from pretty much everything outside of self-employment. What a world. So, that's the kind of larger thinking about flaws in the Constitution that are needed. And again, she left out the general attack on the Constitution, the Federal Reserve, public education, 17th Amendment, 16th Amendment, the Depression, the Dust Bowl, the gold standard, and more. Now start to pull all those factors in and see whether or not you think the 19th Amendment was a good idea, a bad idea, or neutral. I'm also going to toss in here, what about the whole idea of tying more closely the payment of taxes with the privilege of voting, outside of the poll tax, which is unconstitutional because it was used to prevent people from voting who otherwise qualified. But if you're not going to pay, why do you have a say? Right? So there you have it. The Constitution is a fabulous document. It is amazingly and astoundingly strong, especially considering that it's been under serious attack for over 100 years at this point. But addressing the flaws in it, somebody comes up with something that sounds great. Balanced budget amendment, yes, that's what we need. No, it's not. Why? What are the details? What are the factors? What are the factors outside of those factors? And what are the factors that affect those factors that are on the outside of the factors? And then if you make that change, what are the repercussions as they burble their way through society and culture? And I'll say again that this goes back to us as Christians and as students of the Constitution and as conservatives. We ceded the field to the enemy, largely by the churches did this after the Johnson Amendment in 1963-ish. They sold out for a massive pottage their ability to speak on political topics, right? For a stupid tax deduction for their congregants that did not apply to the churches themselves and that most of the congregants didn't need anyways. They sold out for a tax deduction. They chained themselves to the same system that supports Planned Parenthood, and they ceded the field to the Luciferian, Satanists, anarchists, socialists, and then they didn't want to be called names, so they didn't want to say anything, right? If somebody calls you a name, so what? You know, Churchill used to say that if you have enemies, it means you stood for something. So let's speak the truth and make some enemies.